اليوم عنوانها رجال ومال واقتصاد فلسطين الانتدابية. تلقيها علينا الدكتورة شيرين صيقلي، وهي أستاذة مشاركة في قسم التاريخ بجامعة كاليفورنيا سانتا باربرا، ومحررة في مجلة الدراسات الفلسطينية باللغة الإنجليزية، كما أنها محررة مشاركة في مجلة جدلية الإلكترونية. في هذا الكتاب، في هذا العرض يجب أن أقول المبني على دراساتها الرائدة، وعنوانها رجال المال في فترة الندرة، تعالج نمو رأس المال الفلسطيني في الفترة الانتدابية وعلاقة أصحاب الرساميل في الحركة الوطنية وفي تكوين وتقويض اقتصاد وطني في ظل الاستعمار الاستيطاني. وقد درست الدكتورة صيقلي في الجامعة الأمريكية في القاهرة وفي جامعة نيويورك، ولها مؤلفات عديدة في مجلات عالمية. تفضلي دكتورة شيرين.
شكرا سليم. منيح هيك سامعيني؟ اوكي. It's my great honor to be here under the auspices of the annual Burhan Dejani lecture at the Institute of Palestine Studies, and I'd like to very warmly thank Salim Tamari, who was actually very formative for me in this project and my understanding of Palestinian history, as well as Khalid Faraj, who can't be here, and Carol Khouri, who's taken such good care of me. Before I talk about the men of capital that I've studied, I'd like to briefly reflect on the historiography of capitalism and economy over the last decade. Since the recession of 2008, scholars have taken a renewed interest in the study of capitalism. This interest responded in part to a very deep financial crisis, as well as a growing discontent with 3 decades of scholarship that focused on theories of representation, language, and rhetoric. What's now been called the return to political economy has largely focused on U.S. history, albeit in the context of broader changes. And here I thought to share with you just some of these recent interventions in that historiography. However, the questions of how capital works and its relationship to national and international governance are not new. Conventional wisdom holds that capitalism originated in Western Europe and then traveled to colonies in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. After the decolonization of the 20th century, Western scholars and commentators suddenly started calling these colonies developing or underdeveloped. These renditions depict capitalism as a Western phenomenon, which the non-Western world rushed and ultimately fails to emulate. But scholars of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East have long shown that these processes were never so linear nor so coherent. Indeed, one of the linchpins of the Industrial Revolution, those textile factories in Manchester, Britain, depended on the raw materials, the labor, and the expertise of places like Egypt and Haiti. Egypt and Haiti, to name but 2 examples, did not suddenly enter the flows of capital. They were not simply derivative beneficiaries or victims. Their labor, their materials, and their differentiated class structures were crucial to the accumulation of capital. Now, despite the return to political economy of the last decade, scholars and commentators continue to overlook the contingent and messy history or histories of capitalism. On the one hand, scholarship on North America and Western Europe rehearses a Eurocentric perspective that tells its own histories and calls it global. On the other hand, scholarship that focuses on the so-called non-West tends to emphasize case-specific exceptional histories that do not claim to narrate the global. And here is just a couple of examples of some very recent exciting works. This is probably the most recent about Senegal, called Forensics of Capital. And this is a little bit older, called Stages of Capital. So what I'd like to suggest here is that we find ourselves between a rock and a hard place. The rock is one of Eurocentrism, the hard place is that of exceptionalism, and it is here that the history of Palestine, and in particular the history of economic thought in Palestine, I think has many lessons for us. Indeed, I think the history of Palestine can and must speak back to global history. Resisting the urge of viewing Palestine as entirely exceptional is necessary to harvesting these lessons. This resistance is a difficult task given the breadth and scope of the Zionist settler colonial enterprise. Indeed, the experience of cumulative and continuous dispossession has determined not simply how we define ourselves, 48ers, West Bankers, Gazans, refugees, diasporic, but more importantly, how we even study our histories. The terms we use and the realities they describe are outcomes, as everyone in this room all too intimately knows, of colonial partitions and divisions. They are outcomes of this map of the incredibly shrinking Palestine. So my story today begins a little bit before this shrinking. My story is about the 1930s and 40s, although partition was well underway in that period. My talk, as Salim mentioned, draws from my book called Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy in Mandate Palestine. Before I begin, as a framing, I'd like to suggest that the mandate in Palestine was not exceptional simply because of the very faulty ways that people have described it. That is, that the British supported one so-called side over another. That is the Zionist movement over the Palestinian people. The mandate was exceptional because it was the only case in which the Permanent Mandates Commission, that is the commission that was overseeing the territories after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, this was the only case in which that commission officially recognized settler colonialism. Over the last few decades, scholars have really given us and highlighted how Mandate Palestine was a time of intensive literary and cultural production, as well as a very active time of women's movement, labor organizing, and populist politics. But for me, what has been very striking is that despite these contributions, Palestinians who were concerned with capital accumulation, investment, and economic growth are erased from the historical record. One of the reasons that they're erased from the historical record has to do with our own understandings of what is a good nationalist and what is a good Palestinian. But it also has a corollary in Zionist modernization narratives, which I think are very clearly illustrated in this image, in which we understand, in which the Zionist modernization narrative understands and posits two hermetically sealed, self-enclosed economies opposing one another, a pre-modern Arab agricultural subsistence economy and a modern Jewish industrial sector. So while scholars have gone very far at chipping away this dual society model that underpins this narrative, Palestinian elites continue to appear as if they are a unified entity whose practices are staid and unchanging and easily discernible. And one of my main contentions is that this lump is now it's time to actually disaggregate it and better understand these elites. Before I talk a little bit about the character of these people that I've studied, I want to really qualify a few of the disparities that the work is based on in many ways. Certainly, the disparities between urban elites and rural Palestinians were everywhere to be seen during the mandate period. And more certain still, the Zionist enterprise was richer and more equipped than any Palestinian commercial or industrial venture. And here I think it's important to keep in mind that European Jews actually went from generating 50% of Palestine's output in the 1920s to 80% during wartime-induced industrialization in the 1940s. But the corollary of this intensive production was not Palestinian stagnancy. And I think one of the very important things to keep in mind is if you keep comparing Palestinians to Zionists, you actually cannot see a Palestinian story. You have to try and change the perspective in order to really get at Palestinian history. And what I'm suggesting is rather than stagnancy, we actually have access to a very exciting and dynamic story that has important legacies for the present. In the late Ottoman period, already a nascent commercial class that was separate from the landed elite had begun to take hold in Palestine. There were new opportunities in banks, trade bureaus, shipping companies, and commercial agencies, which was already expanding a very small but important group of shop owners, retailers, and commercial distributors. By World War I, there's already a diverse range of local industries, and this includes flour milling, soap making, metal shops. Between 1918 and 1927, Palestinians and European Jews established about 2,269 commercial and industrial establishments. 60% of these are Palestinian. Also during this period, and in particular during World War II, in which the British are essentially transforming Palestine into a military base as headquarters for the World War II alongside Egypt, basically you have Arab industrial establishments and their labor force doubling. Also in this period, what's very noticeable is that Palestinians held considerable cash in the two Arab banks, which expand faster in the 1940s than any other financial institution at the time in Palestine. And just to give you a sense of this kind of capital accumulation, between 1939 and 1946, the total capital in both of these banks grows 14-fold. So clearly there is a Palestinian capitalist story to tell. So let me now consider one juncture in this story. During the 1930s, Palestinian elites basically put forward a project around an economic nahda. And they did this through various periodicals and on radio programs where they're attempting to really shape economy as a sphere of action and a science of the self. And one of the things that is very important, I think, in this regard is because these Palestinians are shut out of state institutions, they're really forming the economy as a science of the self, as an ethical project. One such project is the hitherto unstudied journal Al-Iqtisadiyat Al-Arabiya, which you see an image of here. This is a really interesting journal, which I found with the help of our friend and colleague Munir Fakhreddin, who can't be with us today, who accidentally ran across this journal in the Hebrew University Library. And this is another story to also talk about, which is the archives for this project and which kinds of journeys that I made to find these records. This is a very interesting journal. It hits the presses in 1935. Its chief editor was a man that I would wind up spending a great deal of time with, although he's long gone, named Fuad Saba. And he was the first Palestinian licensed accountant under British rule. The journal begins as a bi-monthly, and it continues as a weekly until 1937, at which point the British exile Saba because of his funding of the rebels in the 1936-39 Arab Revolt. So what's so interesting about this journal, there's many things that I will tell you about why I think it's interesting. But one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of the people in this journal are funding the rebels, but they're not talking about the revolt in any of the pages of the journal. they're also not talking about Jewish settlers. So how do you explain this absence? And for me, how I explained it is that these men, like many of the men of their time, and sometimes women, although less so, were really immersed in a very modernist project in which they were attempting to distinguish between the economic and the political. And it was a sort of relentless project to make this division. In fact, they even called themselves, they called this journal, Iqtisadiyat, as the party organ, not of men of politics, but of men of capital, which is what they called themselves, Rejal Mal. What's interesting about this project, about this journal, is that first you would have a number of articles in which they are basically describing the significance of economy and its relationship to social life, its relationship to gender, its relationship to mathematics, its disciplinary location. They're also translating from The Economist in this period, so they're featuring very interesting translations from The Economist in the 1930s. They're seeing themselves as a crossroads for the exchange of information on economy. They're following all of the very important translations that are taking place in Cairo. And they also see themselves as a vehicle for the spread of knowledge production on economy. So what you have is a subscription base that goes from North Africa all the way to Muscat, Oman, as well as Baghdad. So it's a really a kind of subscription base that echoes what I will talk a little bit about, which is a very regional project, a pan-Arab project. So let me just talk very briefly about who these men were. In the 1920s, Saba established a highly successful team of accountants called Saba and Company. For those of you who know about this company, it continues to be a very important multinational corporation. Others that were involved were men like Abdel Hamid Shoman, who founded the Arab Bank in the 1930s. These were the men who would go on to establish corporations in Palestine after World War II, including Middle East Airlines, which was actually a Palestinian venture, Arabia Insurance, which continues to be one of the most important insurance companies in the Arab world. And as Palestine fell, they would rush to guard their wealth. In the 1950s and 1960s, men like Saba, Shoman, Yusuf Baidas, and Hasib al-Sabbagh would lead some of the largest and most successful insurance, engineering, banking, and contracting ventures in the Arab world. And this, for me, was one of the kinds of realizations that really helped me, because throughout most of my project, and until today, people would make the claim that the people that I studied didn't exist. But actually they did exist, and they existed in such ways to form and shape a kind of business and economic culture throughout the 50s and the 60s. The entry point for me about these men of capital was that they really complicate what I understood as a flattened social topography of Palestinian social life, where we saw the ineffectual, inefficient, infighting, decadent elites, right, the Ayan, the Husseinis, and the Nashashibis, versus a large, undifferentiated mass of peasantry who were honorable but ignorant, and a small group of workers. So that was a kind of entry point to complicate Palestinian social history. As the project shifted and moved, I also understood that what these men help us do is rethink the Nahda. So scholars have rendered the Nahda, which I shorthand as the Arab Liberal Project, as primarily literary or cultural. But it was in fact a diverse archive of thought and experience beginning in the 19th century that could include people like Muhammad Abdu, an Islamic modernist, to socialist thinkers like Amin al-Rihani. Palestine's Men of Capital teaches us that the Nahda is also deeply rooted in the principles of financial investment, capital accumulation, and private property. They force us to engage the role of economic categories in shaping the Nahda. And for me, until this moment, what I find striking and that we very much need in the history of the Arab world more broadly is a history of economic thought on the pages of Iqtisadiyat, the Palestinian men of capital who took part in this Nahda really proselytized economics. They were almost like missionaries. They proselytized new ways of spending and saving as a kind of code of conduct. And at the heart of what they understood was this economic rebirth or renaissance was the proliferation of new commodities, new opportunities for spending, new needs. And private property and individual freedom were basic tenets for them in this compelling new world that they described, full of towering buildings, cinema houses, cafes, and restaurants. These men are hard to understand now because they draw on broad universes of thought. So they drew on everything from Ghazali to Ibn Khaldun to Adam Smith to Rousseau to Karl Marx. And they did that to do three main things. First, to shape economics as neutral and scientific. Second, to define class and status in new ways. And third, to safeguard their own power. So this is what's really interesting about these figures, because they're shaping a new kind of understanding about class at the same time that they're really trying to guard their own hegemony. So one of the things, and you can tell from this image that they're trying to do, is really shape national units textually and visually. And in each of these journals that I've read through and translated, you'd see a sort of a lead article thinking about economy, various world economic news, and then categories and special sections that were national. So you'd have Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, Sudan, the Arabian Peninsula, Syria, Lebanon. And under each of these categories, under each of these headings, the editors would feature commercial legislation, import and export figures, government budgets, custom rates. So what they're really trying to do, like many people in this period, is render an abstract thing called the economy in national, visible, calculable terms. Okay, these are all inventions of this period. These kinds of indices, these numeric representations. But what's interesting about these men is that the national was ambiguous for them. In fact, they were mourning the demise of the Ottoman Empire because they understood that it had brought to them oppressive economic conditions and that it had basically stopped and created unnatural borders of free trade, right? So they're upset they can't trade like they used to in a region that has what they call the common bonds of language, tradition, and culture. So what these editors are doing, what these businessmen are doing, is shaping and presenting to their readers the benefits of capitalist investment in a vision of a pan-Arab capitalist utopia. But not all that was new was beautiful for these elites. The thrilling opportunities for spending both enticed and troubled them. And so you see here various figures emerging on the scene. The anti-hero, or what they would call the false intellectual, couldn't discern between needs and luxuries, and he basically spent with abandon and denied his family the fruits of his productivity. The heroes were men like Ahmed Helmi Basha, the founder of the Arab National Bank, Tahir Karaman, the tobacco industrialist. And these men, what made them heroes for these figures were that they embraced technology, they encouraged investment, and they above all avoided ostentation. Ostentation and the avoiding of ostentation was core to these projects. There are also two similarly contrasting women in this landscape, the Musrifa and the Hasifa. The Musrifa, and she's a character that spans time and space. She's the woman who spends all her husband's money without restraint. She will be familiar to many of us. The Hasifa, on the other hand, was calculated and frugal, but always fashionable. And she directed her endemic consumer tendency to domestic products to benefit the national economy. And here you see some very interesting gender constructions where women are believed to have an endemic, inborn, biological desire to spend money and consume. And the woman was at her most sublime. Oh, this is Fuad Saba. Well, I love this picture. This is actually a picture that his grandson sent me because he Googled himself and found my name and realized I was working on his grandfather and got in touch with me, and I can tell you more about that story. This has an important story too that I will tell you in a minute. But one of the hasifas, the ideal Palestinian scientific homemakers' most important spaces was the home. And I studied a radio program called The New Arab Home, which a woman named Salwa Saeed ran, in which she gave 10 lessons on what it meant to be a good homemaker. And I wound up despising this woman very deeply because she reminded me a great deal of myself. She had clocks in every room. She had booklets where she wrote down everything she spent. She was obsessively clean. She had to have the right kind of food, the right kind of nutrition. And what's interesting about domesticity, and this is something that I think not enough work is done on, is that the spatializing of the domestic space as something that you can calculate and measure so that you can reach progress is often parallel to the spatializing of a national economy that you can also calculate. The other important point about the home is that it comes into being as a site of moral containment. And so for Salwa Saeed, how she would advise the women who would listen to her listeners, she would say, look, there are all sorts of houses of entertainment now in Palestine. And while you may have a tendency to consume, your husband has a tendency to be easily tempted. So if your house is clean and you're scientific and you know how to keep everything in its right space and you know how to manage the domestic budget, you will keep your man at home, right? So this is, I mean, in its kind of more current iterations, I don't know about your grandmothers, but my grandmother always blamed a husband who was not so faithful on his wife's inability to keep a good home. So the other important story about this is that after my book came out, I was in a meeting in the United States, and I ran into Salim in the lobby. And I said, Salim, my book is out, my book is out. And he opened it, and he got to this picture, and he said, where did you get this picture? I said, the Institute for Palestine Studies, I paid for it. He said, this is my house. So Salim's house is in the book, but I didn't know it was his house at the time. So the ideal economic subject, or what these elites called social man, and here I think it's very important because they understood this ideal economic subject as someone who, as a kind of their relationship to commodities as a social relationship. These figures, sort of, this idea of the bonds of mutuality was all-encompassing, but it had many others. The worker, the peasant, the maid, all of these figures haunted the social man and his partner, the scientific housewife. So this is a very important, I think, a pattern that I saw in Palestine that I've seen many others talk about in places like Zimbabwe and many other places, is that while proliferating commodities are an indication of arrival, they're also a deep source of threat because they threaten social hierarchy. So that in these renditions, the worker, the maid, and the peasant could never be the reader, the listener, or the consumer. And in fact, Salwa Saeed, as she was giving her lessons on the radio, would often tell her listener, be careful, your maid is probably listening, and you don't want her to have a sense of self. So these kinds of changes that people were celebrating as a new kind of arrival were also a deep source of threat, and this also comes to a certain point to get at how is it that people like Fuad Saba are funding the rebels, and in part they're funding them because they want to contain them, because they threaten their social hierarchy. How are we doing on time? So these kinds of changes that people were celebrating. 12 minutes? Okay. Let me try and go. Let me try and get through this second part of this story. So the second part of this story, I think, is which I won't have as much time to get at, is to do with how do people define economy and how do people think about economy. In most of the renditions of calculating this abstraction called the economy in various kinds of scholarship, people focus on economic growth and the proliferation of objects. So just like the men of capital were seeing the proliferation of objects for sale as a new way, as a new point in capitalist kind of trajectories, so too have most scholars. I look at World War II to show that actually war and scarcity are just as important for these calculations as are experiences of growth, of economic growth. So the idea here is about basic needs. So in 1941, British colonial officials, and this is an image I found online of Palestinian soldiers in the British Army during World War II, and I couldn't trace it, so I couldn't use it. But in 1941, British officials established the Middle East Supply Center to implement new regulatory economic regimes. MESC, as it was commonly referred to, basically was aiming to minimize demands on Allied shipping, labor, and materials, while at the same time ensuring inhabitants from what the British motto during World War II, which was freedom from want. And its geographic and numerical renditions have really left important legacies for the Middle East more broadly. Okay, I'm going to skip this part. So what's interesting here is that basically what's happening in the Middle East Supply Center is that it's reshaping new notions of the Middle East. It includes 27 territories. It's a mixed bag of territories. Some places are independent. Some places are colonies. It includes about 100 million people. By 1942, the Middle East Supply Center is the central buyer and supplier of all goods in this territory. And it's really making important links between the relationship between governing state officials and private capital. And I can talk a little bit more about that in the discussion. In Palestine, what actually this means on a national level is that the British colonial government in Palestine, in implementing regimes, institutes essentially an army of bureaucrats called the War Department. The largest department in the War Department was a department called the Provision of Essential Needs. And people complained about this, Arabs and Jews, all the time, because basically what the British were trying to do was get into the very details of daily life through various rationing regimes. And in these rationing attempts and in attempts to really control basic needs, because what are the British worried about? The British are worried about maintaining, making sure that the war effort is able to ship materials and labor, but they're also worried about the specter of food uprisings, or what are commonly called bread riots, which are happening throughout the Middle East in the beginning years of the war. And the British have the famine of World War I on their mind, the very deep and profound lessons of the famine in the Middle East, and they're really frightened about avoiding any such catastrophe. And so what becomes very interesting is that what they're trying to do as they're attempting to ensure freedom from want is they're making very, very problematic and fraught links between basic needs, political containment, and development. And so to give you a sense of those links, I'm going to focus here on the calorie. The calorie was an invention that took place by a man named Wilbur Atwater, an American, in 1896. Now, just as the economy was being measured into smaller units in 20th century inventions like the cost of living, the GDP, the GNP, also food was now becoming a politically legible object because scientists were inventing new indices like the calorie and new categories like fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. These people were called nutritionists. Most governments didn't like these people Okay, they were out searching for someone to sponsor them. And the way that they found a sponsor was through American elites in the 1890s. And these elites, these economic elites, are very upset because their laborers are out protesting and striking all the time. I know it's hard to imagine the United States in this way, but in the 1890s it was a very active time of labor organizing. And this is the moment actually that creates the index, the cost of living. Because the economic elites and the nutritionists come together, and the elites say to the nutritionists, tell us how much food and caloric intake these people need so that we can keep them on the factory floor and off the streets. This is the historical moment when the cost of living comes into being. So we often think of these indices, like the cost of living, as if God created them, right, on the 8th day after he rested, right? But they're actually deep historical constructs that we have to take seriously. So I'm going to skip the story about Truman and Herbert Hoover and Keynes, although I love that part of the story, but I feel like Salim is getting antsy and maybe you guys are getting tired. But I think what's really, really important to understand about this period and about the calorie and its relationship to development is that first, it was only the imperative of military needs that actually made nutrition an alive concept that governments were willing to take on. For all throughout the 20s and the 30s, the governments in London refused to see a link between poverty and malnutrition. Governments in the United States as well. Because that meant if there was a link between poverty and malnutrition, if we couldn't blame the poor for their hunger and their poverty, then we had to give them better wages, more welfare, and we had to regulate prices. The only time this changes is because of war. And when governments realize how well soldiers eat could affect the outcome of the war, this is when nutrition becomes an important science that is accepted. And what then happens is the calorie becomes a universal standard. The League of Nations says, okay, so that we can win the war, we're going to institute the calorie as a universal standard. But we're going to say about the calorie that Easterners, Middle Easterners and Far Easterners need less fats, carbohydrates, and proteins because they are less active and they are vegetarian in mind. Okay, so from the very initial construction of the calorie that pretends to be universal, it was differentiated. So the British are armed with these differentiated concepts, and they wind up making a big mess of many things, including a very devastating famine in Bengal in 1942, which takes the lives of 3 million people and could have easily been avoided. They also institute very deep rationing regimes in Palestine, each of which fail profoundly, but they actually affect daily life in very interesting ways, and I can talk about those details. But let me just tell you what how these rationing regimes fail, and then I'll come to my conclusion. Okay, so for one, when these colonial officials are coming to Palestine and trying to institute this calculating, this what they say creating a nutritional economy, they realize that it's very hard to measure anything. Because people in Palestine, the large majority of people in Palestine, rely on the wuqiyya, the ratl, and the kale. And the British are freaking out because these measurements differ across national borders and within national borders, right? So the British attempt to institute the metric system is one of the most controversial measures of the World War II period. Counting people becomes very difficult too. Of course, the Jewish settlement enterprise has full numbers of their people and their populations, but that suddenly the British realize that they have no comprehensive registry of Palestinians. So it's very hard to ration and regulate people when you don't know how many of them there are. Categorizing people was another difficulty. So, for example, they began in the beginning to subdivide Palestinians into Muslims and Christians. Then they realize, well, these people pretty much eat the same thing, so that doesn't work, right? So all throughout, and then there was another figure that really troubled them, which was the Oriental Jew. What do we do with these people? These people eat like the Muslims and the Christians. They don't eat like... So here you see the ways in which these attempts to institute these regulatory regimes really lay bare what they called at the time the two racial expenditure groups of Arabs and Jews. The other thing that for me was very important in this period that I noticed was the way that the poor in Britain was discussed in the same way as the Oriental or the native in Jerusalem. Also, the much maligned figure of the homemaker was someone that transcended the divides of the colonizer and the colonized, the Arab and the Jew, the Oriental and the European. Indeed, if you were to take British nutritional surveys at their word, most nutritional health and budgetary problems in 20th century Palestine were a result of inadequate mothering and ignorant housekeeping. So the domestic manager in Palestine, just as in Britain, was the last to eat and the first to garner responsibility for managing hunger. Now, a large portion of the book is also about how the men of capital that I began my talk with reacted to these changes and these, basically what they understood, the erosion of their economic existence as the precursor for the erosion of their national existence. And what you see here is that their dreams of economic arrival rapidly fade. They no longer have a fantasy of a pan-Arab economic capitalist utopia. They're now talking about an Arab economy versus a Jewish economy in this attenuated space of Palestine. And also their heroes change. For the first time, they start talking about the Bedouin and the Fallah as the true Palestinian authentic consumer. At this point, it is too little, too late to actually affect any kind of solidarity. So let me conclude. My first point, just to get back to what I was just saying, is that the resonance between government policies that sought to contain the poor in Britain and the colonized in Palestine were not accidental or anomalous. This resonance is structural. Secondly, in attending to scarcity and influence on formations of economy, I think this can help us complicate the sort of Foucauldian panopticon that has been so tempting because of how it explains everything, how it tries to explain everything. In point of fact, while the ascendance of new measurements in the 20th century really inspired bureaucrats in Germany to have dreams of omniscience, dreams of being everywhere, British colonial officials in Palestine did not indulge these fantasies. Actually, war impelled them to count people and the goods that they consumed and produced, and as they did so, they realized the depths of 2 decades of apathetic rule. And this case also helps us understand that actually the two points of comparison are between the European Jews and the British colonial government. And if you make that comparison, at least in nutrition, you find that the European Jewish settlement project far outstripped that of the British in both capital and expertise. So also, I think here, thirdly, is a point about development. We've come to understand development indices like growth, standard of living, and the calorie as universal. These indices promise objective means of erasing developmental difference. They promise us that we will be the same. But what happens if we shift our focus away from the process of development to think about how these categories themselves both constitute and enforce exclusion? And I think asking these questions allows us to bridge a divide between the colonial and the national, not just in Palestine or in the Arab world, but far beyond. Nationalists used development, and the formula of development was to effect limited economic improvement so as to contain political upheaval. And while nationalists may have used this formula to oust the colonial rule, they also used it to maintain their own social hierarchy after decolonization. Finally, I want to end with some questions on the exceptional and Palestine. So as I've said, the men and women that I've studied really complicate this flattened topography. I think it's very important for us to understand that these people did not live in a world where they understood themselves to be shadows of the British colonial officials or the Zionist settler. They lived in a world where they did not understand Palestine as neither a political nor an intellectual backwater, but a core intersection in a regional configuration of profit and progress. So we have thought of Pan-Arabism primarily as a post-World War II project wedded to socialism. But in fact, Palestinians that I've studied alongside their Lebanese, Syrian, Iraqi, Egyptian, Tunisian, and Hijazi colleagues shaped a Nahda in terms of capital accumulation, free trade, and investment. So if we step outside of the exceptional Eurocentric binary, we can discern how these men and women's reality were part of a broader Arab liberal project. But it is time that we attend to this liberal age with its utopic visions and its fashionable ideas with more scrutiny. It was not simply or coincidentally exclusionary, it was contingent on exclusion. The poor and the hungry were then, as they are today, either invisible or the personification of ugliness, to be reformed as supplements to, not as actors in history. If we look to the foundational structure of Arab liberalism as contingent on the maintenance of this exclusion and inequality, we may be able to stop eulogizing it just long enough to recognize that it never died. Thank you.
شكرا إلى شيرين صيقلي على هذا العرض الممتع. سأقوم قبل فتح باب الحوار إلى الجمهور سأقوم بتعليقين وربما سؤالين وبعدين نفتحهم للنقاش. فيك إذا تحبي يعني تقومي بالرد علي أو تستني نجمع مداخلات فيما بعد. أوكي. معالجة شيرين صيقلي لتبلور النخبة الاقتصادية في فلسطين فريد من نوعه، لأنه معظم الدراسات حول النخبة كانت دراسات سياسية، وهناك دراسات أخرى حول اقتصاد فلسطين الانتدابية، وهذه معالجة فريدة برأيي حول طبيعة النخبة الاقتصادية في فلسطين اللي ممكن نسميها تبلور ونمو البرجوازية أو الرأسمالية الفلسطينية في سنوات الثلاثينات والأربعينات. استعملت المؤلفة، وهون رح أشير لبعض المداخلات الموجودة في الكتاب بس مش في المحاضرة، يعني واضح أنه في واحدة مستمدة من الثانية، فربما يمكن الجمهور ما انتبهش لهذه الجانب في المداخلة. هل نتكلم هنا عن نخب مدينية أم عن طبقة رأسمالية مهيمنة؟ بمعنى شو القاسم المشترك بينها؟ واضح أنه آلية الاشتراك هو المادة الدسمة التي استعملتيها من مصادر الغرف التجارية، والغرف التجارية كانت تشمل العديد من الشرائح المهنية التي لا يمكن استخدام كلمة رأسمالية إلا مجازا إلها، يعني في تجار كتير، ومنطقة طول كرم وجنين كان في كمان مزارعين، أصحاب بيارات بيافا، أصحاب بيارات باللد والرملة، وفي تجار قسم كبير من تجار في القدس مثلا اللي ما كانوش مستثمرين، أصحاب دكاكين كبيرة، كلهم كانوا جزء من هذه الانتماءات المؤسساتية لغرف التجارية. فشو هو المشترك بينهم؟ هل بنقدر نحكي هون بالمعنى الماركسي أو الفيبري عن الطبقة الرأسمالية فلسطينية، ولا عم نحكي عن شرائح مهيمنة مدنية في كل المدن الرئيسية؟ خصوصا على ضوء الانقسام الذي جابهته خلال الثورة من مؤيد وضد. كأنك بتقولي في بعض الأحيان إنه حزب الاستقلال كان هو الحزب المعبر عن طموحات هذه الشريعة، بس مش متأكد إذا هذا اللي عم بتقوليه. الجانب الآخر هو الإشارة التي تفضلت فيها حول الفكر النهضوي. في نوع من الجبر برأيي في إقحام الفكر النهضوي النابع من الحركات الأدبية في القرن التاسع عشر والتجديد الإسلامي اللي مثله الأفغاني وعبده مع الفكر الليبرالي اللي تبنته هذه الشرائح اللي مثلها أحمد حلمي باشا وآخرين في فلسطين. شو هو المضمون الفكري أو الإيديولوجي النهضوي اللي بنقدر يعني نربط بين